Welcome everyone to the white paper competition for the Wharton People Analytics Conference. As a quick introduction, I'm Annie Heinrich. I'm a first-year MBA student at Wharton and a director of competitions for this year's conference. I'll be your MC for today's finals. I want to congratulate our finalists for making it this far in the competition. We received 28 abstract submissions from teams around the globe, and we are incredibly impressed with your insights and recommendations in your full papers. This competition is very dear to us and our mission to translate fundamental people analytics into industry papers for a wider audience. I also want to welcome our judges, who I'll introduce shortly, as well as any representatives we might have from our competition sponsor, Google. We've been thrilled to work with such amazing experts for this year's white paper competition. We'll start by going through the agenda for today. First, we'll introduce our judges. Then all of our teams will present, followed by Q&A from our judging panel. And finally, our judges will depart to deliberate while we let you all go, and we'll be communicating the results over the next day or so. Before we get started, I have a quick tech request to optimize viewing for the finals. We ask that teams who aren't presenting mute their video while other teams are presenting to make sure our judges get the best view of everyone. Now I'll introduce our judges. First, we welcome Iwa Shirako. Iwa is the lead of Google's People Innovation Lab, PyLab for short, within People Analytics. Her team is currently focused on research and design to inform the future of work. Prior to Google, Iwa served as a visiting professor of management and organizations at NYU Stern. She received a PhD and MS in business administration with a concentration in organizational behavior from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Next, Alex Nakahara. Alex is a senior quantitative analyst at the Philadelphia Phillies, where he creates analyses and tools for understanding and visualizing data for the baseball operations department. He joined the Phillies in 2017 after working for 4 years at Northrop Grumman as a systems engineer. He received a BSc in mechanical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania in 2010 and an MS from MIT in aeronautics and astronautics in 2012. Alex, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Next, Yuan Ha is an expert affiliate at Cognition Analytics and previously was a people analytics leader at Comcast. He has spent his life fascinated by how teams and organizations can harness the power of diversity and continue to push the use of data in improving the performance and well-being of their people. Okay. Do you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone.
Lisa Dunchak is an associate partner in McKinsey's Silicon Valley office, focusing on business building for both technology startups and established enterprises. And importantly, she was part of the founding team of the first Wharton People Analytics Conference in 2014 and received her MBA from Wharton in 2015. So she's seen how far it's come. Is Lisa on?
Hey everyone, I'm excited to see you all. It's so cool to see how far this has come. I hope today is a very fun and interactive session. So I know it's weird over Zoom, but ask questions in the chat and let's keep it lighthearted.
Great. And finally, Michael Hogan is a partner at GH Smart, where he advises and coaches CEOs, board members, founders, and nonprofit leaders on a wide range of topics related to executive talent optimization. Michael earned a BS in chemical engineering from Cornell University and an MBA from Wharton. Prior to GH Smart, he worked at BCG, GE, and DuPont. Michael, you want to say hello?
Good afternoon, everybody. Looking forward to it.
Thank you all again for being here. I think we'll start getting into the presentations. You can see here a thorough randomization in the presentation order. Each team will have 8 minutes maximum to present their analysis and insights. Teams will be alerted in the chat by me when they have 1 minute left and when they have 1 sentence left, which would be when their time's up. And then the judges will have 5 minutes of Q&A to ask team members questions. We may not have enough time for a question from each judge, so I'll write times up when question time is over so we can keep this really tight. Great. With that, I think we can get started. First up is Beyond the Pay Gap. Kate, please go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, so I'm going to be sharing the screen from there, but talking from here. Is that working okay?
Looks great to me.
Great. And then Annie, would you like the judges to wait to the end to ask questions? Should we do it in the chat or what's the best approach?
So I would like you to wait till the end and I'll prompt you and you can just go ahead and unmute yourselves.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Great to see you, and thanks for having us. We're really excited to be here. I'll start, just give a quick introduction to myself and my co-author. So I'm Kate. I'm an incoming MBA student at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I'm also the co-founder of a people analytics company called Talent Tech. My co-author is Lelith. He's a professor of economics at Barnard College and Columbia University in New York, and the original founder of Talent Tech. Okay, so if your news feeds look anything like ours do, you probably have a sense that diversity, equity, and inclusion are key issues for today's businesses. And in our consulting practice, we've definitely been starting to hear this issue come up more often. A lot of business leaders want to know how their organization is doing in terms of diversity and equity, but they aren't always sure what to measure or where to start. So to address this problem, we've developed a framework to help guide companies through an equity analysis that goes beyond classic metrics like pay gaps. So it uses a company's own internal data, and it measures 6 distinct but interrelated dimensions of equity. And to show you how it works, we're going to walk you through an example of a gender analysis that we conducted at a global tech company. So this is a company in the IT industry. They're based mostly in India and the US with about 22,000 employees, of whom about 30% are women overall. So our analysis starts with compensation, and our question is simply whether men are paid more than women. But we start off with 2 different answers. So first, in the organization as a whole, women are paid on average 33% less than men. But when we compare women and men with similar job titles, skills, and company tenure, this pay gap almost disappears. It shrinks to just 3%. It's still statistically significant, but it's practically much less important. So on the one hand, we see a large gender pay gap, but on the other hand, we don't see much discrimination in pay between men and women in similar job positions. So to explain these 2 sort of contradictory facts, we need to look at the representation of men and women across the organization's hierarchy. So this is a rough outline of this company's org chart. At the bottom are entry-level positions, and at the top are people with at least a decade or so of work experience. And of course, compensation is closely tied to these job hierarchies. As you move up the ladder, you get paid more. And when we look at the representation of women in each of these levels, we can immediately see what's really going on. In the lowest level, we have close to exact parity. But at the highest level, the share of women drops to just 11%. For every 1 woman we see at the top, we see 9 men standing next to her. And this, of course, is what explains our organization level pay gap. This underrepresentation of women at the top also points to a wider set of inequities, of prestige, of power, and of access. So what's driving this disparity? Well, the headcount in each level is going to be the result of the past movements in and out of that level. So women could be underrepresented at the top because they're less likely to be promoted from one level to the next, because they're more likely to exit from the higher positions, or because fewer of them are hired into the top ranking jobs in the first place. Of course, it could also be some combination of these 3. So our analysis will look at each one, starting with promotion rates. The question here is, for men and women who are in the same job with about the same amount of work experience, are the men more likely to be promoted to the next level, while the women are more likely to remain stagnant in their current position? If so, this might indicate differential treatment in terms of performance evaluations, training opportunities, or mentorship and sponsorship. But this isn't what we find in the data. What we see is that men and women are equally likely to be promoted to the next level. Next, we look at exits. Here, the question is whether women are leaving at a higher rate than their male counterparts at the higher levels of the organization. This could indicate an old boys club kind of company culture, or it could simply be the result of a broader set of societal norms in which women tend to take on more household and family responsibilities. But again, the data says no. Men and women in similar roles are equally likely to leave the company. Finally, we look at new hires. Here we find the culprit. While women represent almost 50% of new hires at the bottom of the pyramid, they only represent 7% of new hires at the top. So this is the primary source of the underrepresentation. The company is hiring way fewer women into the top positions. Now, this of course raises a bunch of other questions. Is the company discriminating against women in the leadership hiring process? Meaning, are they passing over qualified women because of hidden biases or assumptions? Or is this happening because there's fewer female applicants to these jobs at the higher levels in the first place? For now, we're going to leave these as open questions. And the final phase of our analysis looks at employee well-being. Are there any differences between the sense of happiness that women feel in their jobs compared to men? The data again here shows no significant difference. Women are just as happy as their male counterparts. So putting all this together, we can draw some preliminary conclusions. Men and women, once they're employed, are for the most part treated equitably. They have similar compensation packages, similar promotion rates, similar turnover rates, and similar levels of happiness at work. The big red flag for gender equity in this organization is that women are dramatically underrepresented in the more senior levels of the organization. And the source of this discrepancy is the gender composition of new hires. Now, there's clearly open questions that our analysis hasn't addressed, and maybe we can discuss some of them during the Q&A section. But at a high level, this analysis has given a preliminary diagnostic of what the big problem areas are for this specific organization. In this case, representation and hiring. Now, of course, in a different organization, the explanation for underrepresentation of women could have been different, and the data could have led the analyst down a different kind of rabbit hole. So instead of just a hiring problem, for example, you might see both a promotion problem and a turnover problem. And there, the next step would be to figure out which direction the causality is running. Is it that women aren't moving up because they're quitting too soon, maybe to go and start families? Or are they quitting only after they've been passed over for promotions? So clearly you can see that this is a sort of always going to be this kind of tangled and interrelated set of facts, but this framework that we outline here it's a first step to trying to bring order to these dimensions that are interrelated. And our hope is that it can help companies start thinking about their inequities in a more systematic way, help them to zero in on problem areas, and ultimately help them make evidence-based decisions about how to build a more equitable workplace. So that's all that we have. We can now open it for discussion and questions.
Cool, yeah, I'll start. I think this is fantastic work, and I think some of it is very much corroborated by work that is in the field already, which is great, and I love seeing real world examples. I guess one of the questions that I have is, if you are a company and you're trying to fix this, I think a lot of the problem is also the overall pipeline at the industry level. So if you're trying to sort of more equally hire at those more senior roles, what are the implications for a company based on this research?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's definitely the question that we've had a few conversations with, some of the companies that have this problem about how they view it. And some of them, they do have actually a sense that there may even be these sort of biases at this level where there's an expectation that hires at the highest level are supposed to be available all the time, and that women are less likely to be able to meet those scheduling needs. So I think that there are still aspects of it that are rooted in potentially bias or assumptions. But then there are also, of course, reasons that are rooted in the sourcing problems. And, I think there's a few different things that we've seen companies consider, which is like, look, if we can't go out and hire them in the market, can we come up with a 5-year plan to make sure we're not losing the women in our own pipeline when we already have 50% at the bottom? How do we make sure that sort of filters up?
I mean, 20 years ago, there was this perception, why are there no women CEOs, right? And the idea was that it was a pipeline problem, right? Women started going to schools, etc., much later on. But if you even look at this data, you'll realize that there's complete parity at the lowest level, right? So engineering students came out of universities 10, 15 years ago in almost the same kind of numbers, right? So the explanation has to be a little bit more nuanced to understand things like, is the pipeline, going all the way, or women taking breaks for a variety of other reasons? Or is there actually biases at the entry point? And some of the conversations that Kate mentioned was interesting because when you talk to the folks who are actually doing this sort of admission, the processing at the high levels, they say that, look, at this level, we really need people to be available 24/7. And I think there are probably sort of biases in their minds whether a female applicant who's 40 years old with 3 kids that they're presuming will have that kind of stretch capability. So I think it's much more nuanced, and Kate and I are right now in the middle of trying to get data on exactly what the applicant pool looks like across the hierarchy. So yeah, I mean, it's a crucial question. Yeah.
And I think, Kate, that's a really important point. Like, what does the slate actually look like? Is there a female-male representation across the slate of candidates being put forth for the hiring? And at the same time, is diversity a goal? Is it stated that we will actually ensure that our slates are properly balanced so that there is actually a driving force to push that forward? Is that something that you saw in your data set or any of the conversations you've had with the people you've done research on? Is that something they're talking about? Is that an action that they're looking to take? And also, I would guess that that's also going to be something that's going to lag in the system, and hopefully over time, as that 50% equity at the lower levels, that hopefully with action will increase up the pyramid as well.
Yeah, so it's definitely something that the company is focusing on, but they are, as of now, sort of, and I think a lot of companies do this, is that they tend to focus on this like development piece and the promotions moving up, and do we have mentorship programs in place for the women that we have. And there is a sense that this hiring problem is harder to solve, and it's, I think, for a couple reasons. Like in this particular company, they have to do a lot of like just-in-time hiring, which is like they need someone on a project yesterday, and to sort of add another constraint to that, to say that you have to hit these diversity metrics. I think people have resistance to that in some ways. It's hard. I think it's necessary for them to do it, because so we've looked at that, we've seen a little bit of the applicant data, but they don't it's not mandatory to record the gender at that level, so it's hard to get a complete picture of what those representations look like. But I think there are women that are there. There's not as many women as there certainly are in the bottom levels. There's the female applicants drop off as they move up.
I just had one quick process question. I know we're at time, but let's suppose that when you went to the first question and you didn't observe a gender pay gap, do you still recommend that we go through all 6 dimensions, regardless of what you find? So it's not sequential, right? Just wanted to make sure that was clear on that.
I think that's a good question. No, I think you have to do the entire thing, right? Because these things could work in very perverse ways. So for example, you may see no representation, but the exit rates and the promotion rates could work in sort of perverse ways to give it. And I think what this methodology does is to simplify the process that you should go through, but I don't think you can skip anything. Okay, so you might, I mean, for example, here you might say, oh, the company's paying the same even the same package, for example, depending on skills, etc. But what if you didn't find that? Then, of course, a classic labor economist will turn around and say, oh, there's true, genuine labor market discrimination, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't go down the other rabbit holes to figure out. So I think we got very lucky with this company from an analytic perspective, which is that the story just jumped out, right? That it was a representation problem, and the source of that problem was at the hiring level, right? But you can easily imagine all the different sort of endpoints you could get to and how complex this analysis could be. It's just that companies themselves are not sure exactly where to start to think about this in a systematic way. And in reality, they are actually sitting on a lot of the data that you need to start, at least to get started, and to sort of demarcate and to sort of focus on specific areas where there may very well be red flags. So yeah, no, it's much more complicated than, you know, this nice linear presentation. Kate is very good at putting order to a lot of messy data. So.
Thank you. Thanks, team, for presenting. I think we can go to the next one, which is the impacts of algorithmic work assignment on fairness perceptions and productivity. Hung Chen, please go ahead and present.
Okay, great. Can everyone see the slides? Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for having us. I'm Hanchen Dai from UCLA Anderson, and on behalf of my awesome collaborators, including Bing Bai and Dennis Zhang, who are both here, I'm excited to talk about the impacts of algorithmic work assignment. In organizations, algorithms are widely used to allocate resources and tasks, such as delivery trips, sales leads, and job positions. When deciding whether and how to implement an algorithm, businesses often evaluate algorithms against human decision makers. Traditionally, companies focus on accuracy and efficiency, and in customer-facing contexts, companies also consider soft skills such as communication fluency and expression of empathy. Another metric that is gaining more and more attention in recent years is fairness. There is a growing concern that algorithms may lead to new or more systematic biases than human choices have. Well, one way to think about fairness and other metrics is to look at the actual performance and outcomes delivered by algorithms versus by humans. For example, do algorithms actually amplify historical biases that humans hold? But another important perspective is how people perceive algorithms. For example, do people believe that algorithms are more or less fair than human decision makers? Well, we believe the second, the people angle, is important because people are almost always involved in the application of an algorithm. People's perceptions and beliefs about the fairness of algorithms may affect how people interact with algorithms and organizations using them. For example, beliefs in an algorithm's ability to be fair may influence salespeople's willingness to follow orders from a task assignment algorithm. And such beliefs may also influence job applicants' impressions of a company that rejects their application based on an algorithm. To advance understanding of algorithms' influence on business and society, our teams asks two questions. First, how does an algorithmic task assignment relative to a human-driven process change workers' fairness perceptions? Second, what are the downstream consequences for worker productivity? We conducted field experiments in a warehouse in collaboration with Alibaba and its logistics affiliate Cainiao Network. We focus on picking workers whose job is to pick products from different stocking shelves and take products to a central location. The warehouse management system combines purchase orders to form pick lists. Pick lists contain information about what products workers should get, where to get each product, and how many items to get. During our experiment, when a worker was ready for a new pick list, a pick list was randomly selected from a pool of available pick lists. And then we randomly assigned workers into one of two conditions, and workers stayed in the same condition throughout the experiment. In a human condition, workers got paper pick list from a human distributor. Workers used their handheld monitor to scan a barcode on the paper and transfer the list to their monitors. In an algorithm condition, workers scan a barcode displayed at the task assignment station to get a pick list. Unknown to workers, in both conditions, pick lists were randomly selected from the same pool of available pick lists, so the underlying assignment logic was the same between conditions. Therefore, we could study people's perceptions of those two assignment processes while controlling for the actual assignment outcomes. In both conditions, once a pick list showed up on a worker's monitor, the picking process began, and once the worker finished picking the final product, the finishing time was recorded. We ran two experiments and obtained similar results, so I will focus on the first one. It occurred in the summer 2019 in one of the largest warehouses in Guangzhou. We had 50 temporary picking workers who processed about 4,400 pick lists during the experiment. In our daily survey, we asked workers how fair they thought their assignment process was on a 1 to 5 scale. A higher value indicates greater fairness perceptions. We knew the characteristics of each pick list, so we could confirm that pick list characteristics were indeed similar between two conditions as we intended. We also tracked picking efficiency as our measure of productivity. It refers to the number of items picked per minute for a pick list by a worker. Let's first look at fairness perceptions. we found that workers perceived the algorithmic assignment process as more fair than the human assignment process. The difference was about 1 point on a 5-point scale. Also, workers picked items more quickly in the algorithm condition. The productivity boost amounted to an 18% increase relative to the average efficiency in the human condition. Prior research suggests that workers with a higher level of education tend to have a higher self-esteem and therefore care more about whether they are fairly treated. So those workers should exhibit greater productivity benefits under the algorithm condition. Indeed, for workers with a high school diploma who were considered better educated in our sample, productivity in the algorithm condition was higher than the human condition by 34%. But for workers without a high school diploma, there were no performance difference between conditions. To test whether perceptions about algorithmic work assignments hold in the Western culture, we conducted an online experiment involving 201 people living in the US. They imagined working as picking workers in a warehouse, and they were told that pick lists were assigned by a manager if they were in the human condition, or were assigned by a machine if they were in the algorithm condition. And then we asked people about how fair the process would be. And US people also view the task assignment to run by a machine as more fair than the assignment to run by a human. So to summarize, relative to human assignment, algorithmic work assignment can increase workers' perceived fairness both in the US and China, and further increase workers' productivity, even when the two processes assigned objectively comparable tasks. Those findings suggest that algorithms can have broader impacts beyond offering greater efficiency and accuracy than humans. This gives managers another reason to introduce algorithms if possible, or to highlight existing algorithmic decision process in their organizations, especially for workers with a relatively higher level of education. The finding also suggests that the framing about an assignment process matters to productivity, not just the actual outcomes. Therefore, managers may consider finding the most motivating framing of task assignment process for their workers. We also have additional data that suggests that people both in our warehouse and online thought it was more important for a pick list assignment process to treat all workers equally than to consider individual workers' characteristics. And this prompted us to study something that we're super excited about, that is what people think fairness really means in different settings, and how would such different fairness motives affect their reactions to algorithm. And that will allow us to develop a more comprehensive theory about human reaction to algorithm, so we can help managers better predict how people would respond. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share our work here.
So I just wanted to start and give one piece of praise. I read the paper and I thought it was super clever that you used your experimental design as your instrument so that there doesn't need to be any discussion of the exclusion principle. So typically, if you read an IB paper, half of it is about the believability of the exclusion principle. So I thought that was really, really sharp methodological. The question I had was, this paper is great, but if we think about, though, in multiple periods, let's say that so it seems like people's prior is algorithms are more fair, but let's say that the algorithm did something unfair. How do you think people, and how quickly do you think people would update, or what do you think their reaction would be when the algorithm does something that is perceived as unfair?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. First, thank you for the compliment. In the interest of time, we didn't have a chance to talk about all the exclusion, inclusion criteria for instrumental variables. So I appreciate that you like what we did. Yeah, that's a great question. So first, to clarify, in this research, people did have multiple periods. So people appear several days in our experiments. So they did also have opportunity to learn the outcome provided by algorithm human. Of course, we intentionally try to make human and algorithm comparable in our case, so we cannot directly examine how would people update their belief if algorithm actually behave differently from human. So that is one of the ongoing, that is also related to our ongoing extension, because we want to know how people judge the intentionality of algorithm versus human. We think that's super relevant to your question perception, because it's plausible when people get a bad outcome from a manager, people think the manager must be intentional, the manager must be disfavoring me for some reason. But when it's to come to an algorithm, people may think algorithm to be more innocent. Oh, it could just be in this random case, in this case, due to random chance, I get this worse outcome, but then they were hoping the next day it will become more even. So I think the intentionality and attribution of seemingly unfair outcome would be super relevant as a next step. So far, we don't have empirical evidence to suggest. I'm just speculating that people might be more likely to attribute intentionality to human than to algorithm.
Yeah, it's like fundamental attribution error. Can you do that to a machine? That's
Yes.
It's an open question. The other question I was thinking, like I thought the research was very interesting as well. The approach to the imagined experiment, I'm not sure if you guys have validity or such, just, knowing when somebody's doing something versus someone imagining doing something, I understand the applicability of looking to the US workforce. I just don't know the efficacy of that type of trial versus the core data you got at the warehouse. Just that didn't ring as true to me than the core data.
Yeah, we are totally more excited about the core data as well, which you can see that's why I allocated way more time on the field experiment part. I think the lab experiment serves a couple of purposes. So one is, even though it is a hypothetical scenario, it let me think how to say, like, first it is run in a Western culture, so we can at least get some sense, right? It's really just some sense for us to see how people in the US think about the different assignment process. And also in this case, we also did something that shed light on our ongoing extension. That is, in this research, we actually measured whether people think it is important to prioritize equality or to actually consider individual workers' characteristics. I did not have time to share the evidence. We actually find only when people prioritize equality, they would think algorithm is more fair than human. If people actually think individual characteristics should be taken into consideration by assignment process, then there's no difference in fairness perception. So I think that's another function of this experiment that I didn't get to talk about. We're really hoping to use it to help shed light on our next step. Yeah, so thanks for allowing me to actually elaborate on that. Yeah, but eventually I think for our ongoing work, we would like to use more actual behavior. For example, we have studies planned with freelancing websites such as Fiverr, where we will be able to actually present information to freelancers truthfully and then measure their subsequent behavior.
Can you provide a little more detail on sort of how the algorithm was introduced to the workers? Did they get any foreknowledge of what was involved or what went into it? Just sort of thinking about the questions of fairness and trust. I kind of would imagine that transparency of the algorithm plays a part in introducing trust to the people sort of being affected by it. I was curious sort of how you thought about that.
Yeah, I totally share your intuition that transparency and the trust may matter. I think that itself would be a super interesting research question. In our case, in order to just be able to cleanly estimate the effects of our manipulation, we didn't actually tell workers why we are introducing this algorithm and what this algorithm means to do and how the underlying assignment logic would be, because otherwise it would not be fair to people in the human condition since they do not have additional information. So we want to hold the information the same without giving people additional information in the algorithm condition. But I think it will be a super relevant question going forward as well. That's a nice extension.
Great. I think that's all for questions. Thanks to our judges and thanks Hung Chen to your team.
Thank you for the feedback, everyone.
Great. So I think we'll move on to the next paper, which is hearsay, rumor, and speaking up about other employees' issues. Ethan, you're welcome to.
Everyone hear me okay? Can see okay? Beautiful. So first of all, thanks very much for having me out. I'm really excited to be here. This has been a really fun collaboration. So this is with Taya Howell, who's a former doctoral student of mine now at BYU, and two accounting professors, Steve Steuben, who's at University of Utah, and Kyle Welch at George Washington University. So one of the fun things about this, I'm going to try and blitz through about 3 studies in less than 8 minutes. So buckle up because we're going to have some fun here. So first, I'd love for y'all to imagine an employee coming to you with a concern over working in a racially charged environment. That is, that there's been racial slurs said among white coworkers, And this has influenced things like the promotion process of Black employees. But as it comes out, this employee hasn't actually experienced or heard any of these slurs directly. That is, she's only reporting what her colleagues have been telling her. So just real quick, I want you to kind of take note of what your intuition would say about sort of the validity of her claims as you've heard them, and how this might shape how you make sense of what to do next. And to me, this taps into what's called lay theories, and especially those about secondhand accounts versus people who speak up about information they directly observe. And the example I just gave is actually from a pretty famous case back in the mid-90s in Honeywell, where someone did speak up about a racially charged matter, and that case ended up being dismissed because of this notion of hearsay. There have been similar examples, ABC News most recently with Robin Roberts. There has been claims of racially charged environments there, and nothing was done until those claims were corroborated in a number of other ways. And perhaps most famously, and with as much controversy as can be, we have President Trump, who responded to whistleblower claims of improprietary behavior on a telephone call with the president of Ukraine. And much of his attacks and those of several of his Republican colleagues really centered on the validity of these secondhand accounts. And so what we started to investigate in this study is, well, what are some of these lay theories about secondhand accounts? And are they actually accurate? Does it actually bear out in people's behaviors, or is this much more about perceptions? So what do I mean by the lay theories? So these are taken for granted assumptions that guide behaviors. You can kind of think about them as scientific theories. So we use them in sort of our day-to-day lives to end up making predictions about what will happen. It's how we make sense of the world at large. And the really interesting thing about these lay theories is that they are both rarely tested. That is, we hold these assumptions in our head, but they don't often come up into our consciousness where we're testing and updating how they actually work. And they're quite sticky. So even in the face of disconfirming evidence, we still end up holding these lay theories, which obviously could then have an effect on our behaviors down the road. So what are these lay theories about secondhand accounts? Well, we draw upon two different research traditions. The first is around, it comes from the legal tradition. And there's lots of research on the use of hearsay in court testimony. And the basic notion here is that hearsay, that is people who are reporting not based on their own direct observations, that that testimony should be discounted. And in fact, jury studies have been done to show that people discount and see that these secondhand accounts, this hearsay, is viewed as less credible and less accurate. Moving inside organizations, there's a lot of work on the psychology of rumors and gossip that really paints a very similar story, that the definition of rumors is the unauthenticated information that seems to travel inside organizations. And again, the underlying assumption is that you should view this secondhand information with a bit more scrutiny because it's not as credible as other information. So drawing upon these two kind of research traditions, we then went to discover and uncover what are these lay theories about secondhand accounts. And this took us to a survey of compliance officers. So these are folks inside organizations that whose entire job is to be on the receiving end of employee voice. So that is when employees speak up about issues in their work environment. Not only are they experts in responding to this, but they routinely respond to both first and secondhand accounts, and then must decide if those claims are not only substantiated, but give advice to the organization about whether the organization should take action on these issues. So we first asked a series of open-ended questions about how they respond to internal reports, and then what is their approach and how that may differ between first and secondhand accounts. So we captured some of this open-ended text. We're able to code for various things. And then we also followed that up with a more quantitative survey about their judgments. So first, an overwhelming majority, so roughly about 3/4 of these compliance officers specifically reference the notion of credibility. That is, firsthand reports are seen as much more credible, secondhand reports are less accurate. Similarly, about 2/3 of them, about 60%, saw that secondhand accounts provided less completeness. That is, they were biased in some way. You couldn't follow up and ask questions that really provided the entire account because they were hearing this from other folks. They could only observe a partial account of what actually happened. Following up some of these qualitative quotes, we actually asked some questions about the credibility, completeness, and then the likelihood of action. And these statistics supported the very same intuition. So that is, firsthand accounts are seen as more credible, secondhand accounts as more incomplete, and that the likelihood of action being taken was for firsthand accounts. So kind of a question coming out of this is, well, managers rarely encounter the counterfactual. When you receive a report, rarely do you ask the question, if I receive this information from a different source, how would I respond differently? And more importantly, most of the research that I've noted thus far is about understanding people's beliefs about what the norms are for responding in this case. Their behaviors could be quite a bit distinct and different. So drawing on this tradition, we looked at research on pro-social motivation. So if you, by speaking up on behalf of someone else, you are helping them, and that could be seen as much more influential and in a positive light. Similarly, when you speak up on behalf of someone else, you are bringing social proof. That is, you're not the only account, you're bringing several with you, and that also seems to provide some value. So we tested actual behaviors in an archival data set. This is roughly about 2 million internal reports filed within about 1,000 publicly traded companies. This is one of the largest software platforms that handles internal reports. In this system, we can denote if the report was filed in a first versus second hand, and we can also see whether action was actually substantiated or not. There's, of course, a number of different topics which we account for as well, but this kind of gives you a flavor. Most of these ideas or most of these issues are not, the accounting or fraud claims. A lot of them are just about HR issues. And so what we found is that secondhand reports are actually substantiated much more often than firsthand. We followed this up with a whole bunch of other statistics as well. And in the last study, we were able to find that that these secondhand accounts were seen as much more pro-social, much more valuable, and this really caused them to implement them at a much greater rate. So to sum up, our management implications from this, one of the things we talked a lot about is to kind of use blind auditions. So if there is this notion that secondhand accounts should be discounted, perhaps hiding the source of them as compliance officers receive them could be a way to reduce this initial bias coming in. And then to develop more specific protocols to go through and assess some of these secondhand accounts could be another way as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we can take 2 questions just to keep to time.
So Ethan, it seemed to be a big difference between significant legal material ethical issues between compared to some of the more, say, commonplace HR issues inside of organizations. The applicability of this seems to, it starts off with kind of the larger picture and then goes into more of the HR side, not to say that in a demeaning way. What do you think about the application of these different types of areas to what your findings are?
So one of the things that I kind of glanced over pretty quick in the second study of these of the archival data set is we're actually able to look across the different topic areas. So this ranged from serious financial fraud claims, business integrity claims, but also a lot of the HR issues. Now, most of my intuition coming in and looking at internal reports is that most of these issues had to do with illegal or unethical territories. But in fact, a large majority of them had to do with kind of run-of-the-mill HR issues, and most of them had to do with issues with their direct managers. And so across each of these about 6 different topic areas, the rates of substantiation for secondhand accounts were similarly substantiated much more often than firsthand accounts. It really didn't matter across what topic area. So that's kind of answer number 1, is at least with the data that we have from that, is it really didn't matter if it was very kind of legal territory or others that were a little bit more benign. In the third study, in the scenario experiment, we actually did a couple different conditions. And one, we removed sort of any tinge of a legal territory at all. It was just much more of like a scheduling issue on the HR side. And we still found a similar effect. So again, we tried to make this a little bit more of a conventional managerial issue that any general manager would encounter as well.
Were you able to look at the people who are doing the secondhand reporting at all? I was thinking, like, if you might need to normalize for like their rank in the company. If they're a higher ranking person or had some measure of like more intrinsic credibility, maybe that could be a cause.
Yes, we tried to tackle this in a couple different ways. In the software platform itself, we had very little information about the specific individuals involved, just like we didn't have any access to the actual text of the claim itself. Obviously, a lot of these things are pretty touchy topics. So we're relatively limited in that data set in understanding who that person is, with one exception. And that is a good chunk of these reports were submitted anonymously. And so with that, we can start to cross some of our effects by if they were 100% anonymous or if they were identified. And once again, the rate of substantiation across those two is relatively the same, especially as you compare first versus secondhand accounts. Probably the better way to account for this, because there's a lot of omitted variables that we just can't account for in the second study. That's the reason why we ended with a third experiment. And by that, we're essentially controlling for any of these characteristics about the person who's speaking up in the first place. And the only difference between them was whether or not they raising an issue on their own behalf or on behalf of someone else.
Thank you, Ethan, so much. Appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to Margaret for There Are No Colorblind Models in a Colorful World.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to present here today on behalf of the team, which includes David Anderson from Villanova University and David Ross from University of Florida. Over the past decade or so, we have seen analytics really revolutionize every aspect of the organization. And now we are witnessing an explosion in the availability and application of analytical tools in the HR space. And the potential of these methods is undeniable. However, we cannot simply translate the analytical approaches from accounting and operations over to the HR department. What is so critically different is that in contrast to, say, determining the right stock levels of jeans or which ketchup brand to put on sale, the decisions that are supported in the HR department can have an instrumental impact on employees' lives. So who gets hired, receives a promotion, or is identified as a promising employee? Therefore, the analytical applications in HR really need to be unbiased, transparent, and fair. Unfortunately, there are multiple examples of analytics gone wrong. I will take 2 examples from the recruiting process. Perhaps the most famous example of biased analytics in the HR domain is the internal tool that Amazon built to screen CVs of applicants. They built their tool on past employee data, and since in the past their successful employees were mostly men, the tool identified traits that are associated with men as indicators of success. To the extent that the tool penalized CVs that included the word women's, and it downgraded graduates of 2 all-women's colleges. The second example is a commercially available tool that uses AI to analyze tone of voice, language, gestures, facial expressions to create a behavioral personality profile to speed up candidate screening processes. They claim to deliver a more objective, fair, and faster recruiting process. However, a study by BR News showed that the scores were significantly impacted based on simple props, like glasses or wearing a headscarf. Further, the video background equally impacted the behavioral score. In our paper, we provide additional motivating examples However, in this talk, I want to focus on the analytical process and what we need to do to get things right. So on the surface, the analytical process is straightforward. We start by collecting our data. We then build our models based on this data. The model provides a predicted outcome that is then incorporated into our decision-making. While this process may appear objective, it's filled with human judgment and bias that can enter the process at any point. Therefore, additional steps need to be taken in order to ensure that our people analytics tools are fair and equitable. First, we need to take the time to understand data biases. Data biases can stem from multiple sources. I will only briefly mention two. There can be direct bias. So, for example, when we include biased performance evaluation data in compensation models. Or there can be more subtle indirect bias stemming from the use of proxies, such as using grade point average as a proxy for intelligence. But as we know, grades are, for example, influenced by the need to work alongside school. Our algorithms then interact with our data to produce the analytical tool. I want to highlight three principles that are important in our HR context. First, models will typically perform best for the majority group because a good performance for that group simply weights the most in the overall accuracy, which is the measure that most off-the-shelf algorithms actually optimize. Second, simply removing demographic variables from the data will not lead to gender-blind or racial-blind models. Because in the data, there are other factors that both correlate with the outcome and the demographic factors, most algorithms will pick up on these. Third, and similarly related to representation in the data, if our data is not balanced, even carefully built models will not lead to equal outcomes across groups. As an example, in a company where most managers in the past have been male, a well-constructed model that identifies future managers will likely be more likely to falsely identify male employees as management candidates compared to females. And similarly, the algorithm is more likely to miss deserving female candidates. For all of these reasons and others that we specify in the papers, we need to be especially aware of how the models perform across demographic groups. One tool that can be helpful in that aspect is a bias dashboard that breaks down the model's performance for different groups. Here, we have broken down the performance by gender and included both statistical performance measures, for example, the accuracy, and we have summarized the impact of the model. That is, after incorporating the model into our decision-making process, how do the different populations actually benefit? In this context, it's also important to note that fairness is not a statistical measure. So while we can measure the model's accuracy, we need to specify what an equitable application of the model looks like. What does equal treatment of individuals and groups mean in our context? And then we need to monitor the performance both statistically and using these fairness or equity criteria. There are additional aspects of the bias-aware process that I invite you to read all about in our paper. For example, there are multiple modeling approaches that we can apply to build more equitable models. We need to understand how the outcome definition affects different demographic groups. Further, we need to ensure equity in the model's application, as I briefly mentioned, and we need to be aware of feedback loops. It's also important for the HR models to remember that our data represents the past. And in contrast to many other analytical applications where we can just go back and collect more data, we cannot go back in time and hire a more diverse workforce. Therefore, as we build towards the equitable workplaces of tomorrow, we need to carefully consider what is missing from our data and how those and other considerations will be accounted for in the decision-making process. So it's our sincere hope that the paper can serve as a guide for those implementing or adopting analytical tools in the HR space. For that purpose, we have translated the bias awareness process into checklists, one for internal analytical projects and another for adopting an external tool. For example, some of the key questions to ask of vendors include, how do you measure bias? How do you monitor it? And how fast will we discover if there is an issue? Because if we are aware of the data biases, how algorithms interact with underlying data, and how modeling results are then translated to decisions, we can really start delivering on the promise of people analytics. So by asking the right question of the data, the models, the decisions, and the software vendors, managers can really successfully harness the power of people analytics to build the high-achieving, equitable workplaces that we are all striving to obtain. So thank you very much for this really fast introduction to fair algorithmics in the HR space.
Cool, I have a question. So in the paper you mentioned using, doing a FOIA request, which I always like, to get some data from VA. Can you talk a little bit about the analysis there and how that impacted the conclusions that you have on these models?
Sure. So to give you a background, this is a FOIA request that is actually in the public domain. And this is part of a much larger project. So I come to people analytics from the pay equity background, and we are doing a longitudinal analysis of pay equity along with other things based on this FOIA request. So this was the example that we took in the paper, and thank you for asking about it, because squeezing this into 8 minutes, that got left out. So we wanted to have at least one illustrative example in the paper, and a lot of the data that we deal with on the pay equity side is privileged, so we can't talk about it. So that's for the FOIA data was really great. So what is interesting in that example, and to give the rest of the audience a little bit of background, so what we were using was IT persons in the VA, and we were looking at promotions. And what we found that there was a large difference in the rates of promotion. And then when we did dig deeper, we actually found that there was bias in the data if we take and if we assume that we have the information that we need for people to be promoted. So setting that all aside, and what we kind of state in this example is, I think is important in this context, is that since we in the data we observed the different rates of promotion, right? And then we started to dig deeper. So why is it, right? So maybe it's because all the males have more skill, right? But what we found was that when we included gender in the model, the promotional model, we actually found big discrepancy. We can call it discrimination. So then the question is, which is something I didn't touch upon in this talk, is, so then what? So how do we deal with that, right? So if we know that our past data is biased because of past biased decisions, how do we move forward? So the route that we took with the VA data was that we explicitly accounted for it. So, we're building this model to identify managers or employees that are, potentially going to be promoted to managers. We literally modeled the bias, accounted for it, and raised the scores of the females accordingly to move forward with less biased model.
I had a quick question for you. So what if methodologically, what if instead of just throwing out like gender variable, let's just stick with gender, I only model the majority, and then I take the fitted values from the majority model and then just apply those fitted values to the minority population. So therefore, I'm removing anything that could look like race, gender bias. Is that valid, or what am I like where does that fail?
That fails because then you're assuming that the same characteristics are indicators of success, whereas promotion or everything else across all demographic groups. So assume, for example, that we have an engineering firm or just any kind of firm, it has been male dominated in its promotions, and it just happens that all of the males that we had hired were electrical engineers, right? So then, okay, if we just go ahead and then build our models, we might find, oh, you know, electrical engineers are the ones we want to promote, right? We might not have any female electrical engineers. Maybe we have industrial engineers, right? But if there were no male industrial engineers, we know nothing about how well industrial engineers do once promoted. So that's the underlying assumption that you're making, that where I would disagree with, right, is assuming that the same characteristics and the same indicators of success hold across all demographic groups. And this is where it comes, where it's so important to keep this in mind as we are, you know, every single organization is building their diversity inclusion initiatives and trying to hire more diverse and inclusive workforce. We have to realize that we don't have data on the managerial potential of some of these populations. So then bringing those considerations into these analytical processes, I think, is so crucial.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I think we'll move on, but thank you for the insightful comments. Lastly, we have gender differences in response to requirements in job advertisements. Philip, please go ahead and present your screen.
Thank you. So thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to present our work. And today I'm going to present work that was a part of a wider team effort, led mostly by Leonie Nix, who was a policy lead on this project, along with our colleagues at the Behavioral Insights team and the Predictive. And this work was conducted thanks to the funding from the UK Government Equalities Office. So I'm going to start with a quote that inspired us to do this research. According to a widely circulated claim, men apply for a job when they meet only 60% of the qualifications, but women only apply if they meet 100%. The statement has been extensively mentioned in various reports, journals, and books, to the extent that we could say that it functions as a lay theory among the HR circles. However, is this statement actually true? An investigative journalist at Huffington Post revealed that this statement originates from an internal Hewlett-Packard report and is not based on any empirical data, but is in fact a quote from an interview with one of the senior managers. We think that the reason why the statement has been so popular is that it's a powerful story that resonates with our intuitions. However, stories are not studies, and our intuitions often fail to reflect reality. And therefore, we decided to verify this claim in an experiment. We're interested in several different questions, but here I will highlight only the elements of the design and results which we think are relevant for practical applications. In this experiment, we invited 10,000 people to view a hypothetical job advertisement. We restricted our sample to people who are currently looking for a job or plan to do so in the near future. The job advert was intentionally generic and could be describing a leadership or a project management position. It emphasized that we are looking for exceptional communication skills, teamwork, leadership, problem solving, and project management skills. After participants viewed the advertisements, we asked them how likely they will apply to this job. Afterwards, we asked them to fill in a questionnaire that assesses how frequently they perform actions that could be treated as evidence for having one of the 5 soft skills mentioned in the advertisement. For example, we asked them how frequently in the past they wrote emails to external clients as evidence for having communication skills. At the end, we also asked our participants 2 questions. First, how well do you think you meet the requirements for this job overall? And second, a more specific question, to what extent do you think you fulfill each of those job requirements? Now, what did we learn from this experiment? First of all, there were no gender differences in the quality of potential applicants. In other words, we started with a pool of 10,000 equally qualified men and women. However, gender differences emerged in the pool of actual applicants. Overall, men were 3 percentage points more likely to say that are willing to apply than women. On the other hand, we saw an emerging difference in the quality of applicants. Women who decided to apply had 3.4 percentage points fulfilled more requirements than the men who decided to apply. Although significant, this difference was not nearly as dramatic as 100% or 60% as suggested by the popular claim. And this difference is illustrated here on the graph on the right. To dive a bit deeper into the data, we created a statistical model that allowed us to assess if men and women behave differently, depending on the percentage of their relevant qualifications. This graph illustrates the main findings from this model. The horizontal axis represents proportion of requirements that a given person fulfilled, and the vertical axis represents their willingness to apply. What's striking is that the gender difference emerges only for less qualified people. Men and women converge in their willingness to apply the more qualified they are. Now, what could be driving this effect? We have hypothesized that despite being equally qualified, men and women differ in how they perceive how qualified they are for the position. Indeed, our statistical tests confirm that the gender difference in willingness to apply can be partly explained by men self-perceiving that they've overall fulfilled more requirements. In fact, plotting men's and women's overall self-perceptions of how well they fulfilled the criteria reveals a very similar picture as the one for the willingness to apply, where less qualified men think they overall are more qualified than similarly qualified women. However, this is also not a full story. By exploring the data, we stumbled upon an interesting dichotomy. When we asked people how they fulfill the requirements of overall, we saw a pattern described before. However, this pattern disappears or even reverses when we ask people about each specific requirement separately. I think this is a promising avenue for potential interventions that could address the differential application behaviors between men and women. To conclude, first, despite starting with a balanced pool of potential applicants, we ended up with more male applicants overall and more qualified women applicants. This echoes many of the patterns that we observe in data sets of companies that we work with and reflects general experience of HR managers. Second, women needed to fulfill 3 percentage points more requirements before they were equally willing to apply, so suggesting that there is some grain of truth in common beliefs. Third, gender differences emerge only for less qualified potential applicants. And we think that this is particularly problematic when the hiring processes are imperfect and are not able to reach the most promising candidates. Finally, our data suggests that encouraging potential applicants to focus on how they fulfill each specific requirement might be a promising way to counteract gender imbalances in application behaviors. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
No questions, but as a woman who has talked about this statistic, I am eminently entertained by this presentation and think it is fantastic that you did this work.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions from the judges?
Sure, I can jump in. I was just curious, was there any way for you, either in this study or subsequent, to look at a set of hiring managers and their perceptions of how qualified these women are versus the men? Because you have that objective measure, but really, like, to me, I feel like the perception would be an interesting addition.
Sure, so we did not do this study, but obviously we do know that men and women are differently assessed, especially in interviews. So I think there are other research speaks to that there are some differences in how women and men are perceived, although being equally qualified.
Thank you so much, Philip. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks everyone for your presentations and insights. On behalf of the whole Wharton People Analytics Conference team, thank you to all who participated today, and a huge thank you again to our judges for their time and expertise. I am now going to send the judges to a breakout room to deliberate, and we'll be joining them shortly. Thanks to everyone else for joining the finals. You can all drop now and have a great day. We'll be announcing the winner over the next day or so.